Welcome to my instructional video, The Tales of Nmedi Okorafor by Diana Marquez. This presentation will focus on when and why did Okorafor start writing, as well as what helped her stand out, the learning curve she had to overcome as a new writer in science fiction, her achievements, not based on awards and certifications, but rather what has her work accomplished for the genre and society as a whole, and lastly, what Okorafor has her mind set on for the future. It all started when she got diagnosed with scoliosis at an early age and at 19 had to have surgery to better her quality of life. Due to the delicacies of the surgery, she became hospitalized and bedridden for months. During her stay at the hospital, a friend of Okorafor gave her the novel I, Robot as a get-well-soon gift, except Okorafor didn't read the book. In fact, her first time writing was in the margins of the book, and only years later did she read I, Robot and found it to be a very enjoyable book. Prior to this, Okorafor enjoyed reading. She was a big fan of science fiction, but it wasn't until she was in the hospital, writing in the margins of I, Robot, that it had occurred to her that she could do more than just read stories. She could also write them. She gravitated towards science fiction because she identifies with living on the border of two worlds, more specifically by being Nigerian American, a Quanchi term for meaning being both Nigerian and American, all in one. She understands things through multiple perspectives and is able to add a new dimension to once traditional stories. When in the process of her first book, Zara the Windseeker, her goal was to give little Nigerian girls a space to dream and escape the thousand chores due that day. And although she writes primarily for a Black audience, she encourages everyone to indulge in her stories. She explains, "Just because a story isn't written specifically for you does not mean that you can't relate to it. If that were the case, growing up I'd have nothing to read." This aspiration led to her changing her career path from a professional athlete to a professional writer. And after graduating from the University of Illinois with a PhD in literature and an emphasis in creative writing, her work was destined to stand out. The workload was rigorous and many of her friends had the writer beaten out of them, but years of playing competitive sports prepared her for the pressure she faced in university. Okorafor credits a lot of her uniqueness to her time in academia. She believes that because it was so stringent, she was able to unlock a writing that came straight from her soul, regardless of what other people think of it. Often, writers default to making what sells, but her university didn't want her to submit monetizable work. They wanted real, meaningful stories. Okorafor's writing was unlike anything her peers or seniors had ever seen. Which brings us to her learning curve. People don't like change. She learned her work perplexed the publishing industry, and many told her it was uncategorizable, and for that reason, it was unsellable. In the writing workshop she attended, people misconstrued one of her novels to be pro-female circumcision when she was truthfully writing about real experiences in Africa. She learned there was a growing backlash against people trying to bring different perspectives to the industry. A group under the name Rabid Puppies would come together to vote off what they deemed to be boring multicultural messaging and annihilate any chance of winning writing awards. But most importantly, Okorafor learned that there was an untapped market of people that wanted to hear stories for and about Africa. Okorafor spoke at an adult program for a library and brought in a crowd of over 200 people. Normally, this library maxes out at 20. As a woman who's putting Black and brown characters at the center of her stories, it's no wonder she's bringing such an audience from those overshadowed groups in science fiction. So what does she do? She doubles down. She fights the uncategorizable criticisms by making a new category to fully encompass the depth of her work: African futurism and African jujuism. Kenyan filmmaker Wanuri Kahiu says, "When the production company asked who I most wanted to work with, Nmedi was the obvious choice." Okorafor is far from the first Black woman in science fiction, but through her work, Okorafor has brought African stories to the mainstream and proved to the masses that people want to see multicultural stories, that it's possible to make profitable work without centering Western ideas. Though she never intended to make these tales mainstream, she's simply a woman who loves stories, who writes stories she'd like to hear, more importantly, stories that have been a part of her whole life. In the future, she hopes to be able to adapt more of her stories into shows and movies, but is stretched thin enough as it is. As we've seen, she's a woman with a vision, and nothing will stop her from sharing her stories with the rest of the world. Here's my works cited, and here's its continuation, and you can tune back in a couple weeks to see my second monthly focus. Thank you for watching, and have a lovely day.